Want to know how Canada's top entrepreneurs think about creating significant wealth? Join me, Thane Stenner, founder of Stenner Wealth Partners at CG Wealth Management and host of the Smart Wealth Podcast. Download today at iHeartRadio or your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe now.
Hello, everybody. I'm Thane Stenner, host of the BNN Bloomberg Brand Studios Smart Wealth Monthly Podcast, and very pleased to be hosting and everybody listening in today. Our podcast seems to be garnering a lot of attention these days and growing very steadily each month. So I'm very pleased about that, and hopefully all the listeners and viewers today will get some really good nuggets from another expert that I'm very pleased to have on. So, this podcast is all about, candidly, me getting the opportunity to interview some pioneers and experts from various industries and backgrounds within my network and within, the global network at large. And today we have a very special guest. His name's Lorne MacLean. Welcome, Lorne.
Yeah, happy to be here. Good to talk to you again.
Likewise. I've, on a personal touch, I've known Lorne for over 30 years. So I'm dating myself a little bit. I have personally also utilized his professional services to much acclaim and satisfaction. So put that disclosure up front. But Lorne is recently been awarded one of the top 25 lawyers in Canada in family law. And the MacLean Law Group is highly recognized and has been an award excellence winner in 2023 and 24. So the topics that we're going to discuss today are near and dear to a lot of people. It's family law, and particularly around issues that high net worth families need to kind of work through and get challenged by from time to time. So before I get into that, I want to give you a little bit of a brief bio around Lorne. Lorne is a King's Counsel, and so that's separate and different and distinct from Queen's Counsel, which I've been more familiar with in the past, and we'll get Lorne to explain that shortly. But he's the founder of the top-rated MacLean Law Group, and one of Canada's most experienced and highly rated family lawyers, dedicated to family law and divorce in British Columbia. Lorne has also been chosen, as I mentioned earlier, in the top 25 Canadian lawyers list, and has been in the BC business leaders category as well. So again, very experienced in what he does, and his experience really pertains to dealing with the complex issues of high net worth families. I mean, overall, and he's come prepared with some various examples and stories to share with us today. So I'm very pleased about that. So with that in mind, I'm just going to kick it off here, Lorne. Just for the audience, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your background, how you came in, why'd you enter the law profession, the legal profession, just to give a little bit of a backstory for everybody.
Yeah, I did my Bachelor of Science at UBC, and I thought I was going to become a doctor. And then as I progressed through, I become sort of more and more passionate about becoming a lawyer. So I ended up going to Osgoode Hall Law School back in the late 70s, graduated in 1982. And strange enough, in my second year, I really had no inkling that my career would end up being in family law. And most lawyers are told to stay clear of that area because it's very stressful and very high pressure. But in my second year, what happened was one of the professors that was going to come over from England at the very last minute canceled. And by then, everyone had booked all their classes. And so I said, okay, well, I just need a new class. They said, they're all full. I go, well, guys, you've got to accommodate me. And they said, well, we can put you in the family law intensive program. You'll work downtown with top Toronto family lawyers, judges. Rosalie Abella, I worked a week with her, who in Supreme Court of Canada. And I wasn't really enthused until I started doing it. And then I discovered the passion for family law. And, one of the things I've said when I'm up in the Supreme Court of Canada is that family law is probably the most important area of law for Canadians. It impacts at least 50% of the families. And we can't afford to get it wrong, because if we have a weak family law system, then we're making Canada weaker as a nation. So we touch on everything: tax, corporate, trusts. At the high-end level, we are basically like a high-end tax and corporate lawyer, but someone that goes to court and can battle for you. And the more we battle and the more we win in court, the more we can keep you out of court. And you'll be surprised how many people want to settle with you when they know about your record as a gladiator in the court system. So I love it. Some days it's frustrating. Other days we're high-fiving here. It's basically like Family Law Suits TV show, basically West Coast. So yeah, that's the background.
Excellent. Thank you, Lorne. And I think it's evolved into a practice. Like, just maybe give us some examples of how many lawyers in the firm, where it's situated.
We range around 20 lawyers. Both my sons came in and became family lawyers. And my son, Fraser, who's a rising star, I'll tell you about one of his high net worth cases he did recently. It was in the paper and on the TV. It was also Canada's first fake artificial intelligence cases where someone used ChatGPT and printed out two completely fake cases. We have offices in Alberta. We have several offices in BC. We did have a small office in Toronto, but at some point you just got to focus on the home base. So our HQ is down here on the waterfront. You can see some planes sort of slowly going by there, taxiing by behind me. In downtown Vancouver, we do pretty much exclusively high net worth and ultra high net worth. We also have one of the largest Mandarin family law departments in Canada as well.
Interesting. So before we kind of delve into some examples or illustrations or cases that you've set precedents on actually in Canada, maybe just what's your take or reading on what the current landscape is like based upon the economy and based upon what's going on? Like, are there more challenges today than there were 5 years ago? Are there less challenges?
Well, family law sort of operates on a pendulum. So back in the 1970s and the 1980s, we brought in a new Divorce Act, and there was a thought that maybe we would have no-fault divorce, which is now the primary ground. Most people will just proceed on a 1-year separation. Adultery and mental physical cruelty might make up 2% of the total cases in Canada where people are asking for divorces. And if it was just a divorce, things would be pretty simple. But when you get into spousal support, child support, property division, and parenting and guardianship, then that's where the fighting happens. And in the old days, we had sort of more of a clean break approach and smaller spousal support awards. But and we had tax deductibility both for child support and for spousal support. So things started to change. I've seen the evolution. Back in 1997, they canceled the deductibility of child support. And the thinking from the government, the way they sold it to people was, well, the poor custodial parent is having to pay tax on the child support. We should make them tax-free, and the payer shouldn't be able to deduct it. What they didn't tell people was it brought in almost an extra $1 billion of tax revenue to them, because the payers were generally at the higher tax rate and the recipients were at the lower tax rate. Then what they did after they took the tax relief out, so if you're at the 54% tax bracket and you paid $1,000, the payer was paying $460 out of his pocket. The recipient was probably getting $800. Well, once they got rid of that, they said the recipient will get $500. So the recipient didn't get a penny more, but the payors lost tax deductibility, and the big winner was Canada, the Canadian government, taxman. Then in 2005, spousal support, which had also been, there was this concept of self-sufficiency and people should be able to move on. Look, we have a no-fault divorce. Starting in 2005, they came out with the Spousal Support Advisory Guidelines. The short phrase for it is SAG, which is basically what the payors' shoulders do when they find out just how high support became starting after 2005. So we came up with a concept for spousal support that the longer the marriage, the greater the presumption of equal standards of living at the end of the marriage. So that often means a 50-50 division of the income of both parties. And that wouldn't be so bad if each party, for example, earned $1 million. Nobody's having to pay anybody anything. But when one person earns $50,000 and one person earns $1 million, we're talking about $450,000 of payments annually to get them both to 500.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that Canada is probably one of the most generous spousal and child support regimes in the world. There is a presumption of 50-50 on property, so that's not a surprise. What's different about Canada and some of your viewers in the States, Mexico, Singapore, China, and things like that is we do have still spousal support deductibility, but United States does not, Mexico does not, Singapore does not. So when we get into the ultra high net worth people who live in more than one jurisdiction or may work in a jurisdiction where support is not deductible and the recipient lives in Canada, our system sort of breaks down. It's mathematical formula from the spousal support advisory guidelines. It doesn't work for these people that have more than sort of one nation that they reside in. So I would say it's gotten more generous, but more recently, the pendulum may be starting to swing back to a little more focus on self-sufficiency, which for high net worth payers, when I'm acting for them, that's something we appreciate. So the recipients are probably pretty happy under the current regime. And we'll talk about the $100,000 award I got for a lady with $25 million. My son, Fraser MacLean, just got $30,000 a month from a gentleman in China worth $70 to $90 million. The awards are big. Yeah.
So just to give some context for folks, like you've been in the industry for 30 plus years. Like how many cases have you worked on professionally?
Probably thousands. I'm now in my 41st year of practicing, and up to the Supreme Court of Canada twice, BC Court of Appeal numerous times, Supreme Court, usually on a lot of mega trials, and we handle, as I said, Mandarin speaking clients. We have a ton of those, and their net worth is huge. And so those are high stakes cases all across the board. So hundreds of ultra high net worth cases, probably thousands of cases in total.
Gotcha. And as far as just curious, what would be the split between representation of the payors versus the receivers?
Yes.
Pretty equal?
Yeah, I'd say straight 50-50. I never thought it made sense to be one of these lawyers that just picked one side of the fence to argue on, because I think then you get biased and you get pigeonholed. So much easier potentially to win for the wife if they are the lower income earner. But, you see the demographics now of more women going to university than men. And it seems that, that may change. And we do get cases where the women are the high net income earner. We've got one now, large mining executive type case. And, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So.
Yeah, well said. Listen, everybody, we're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us.
Want to know how Canada's top entrepreneurs think about creating significant wealth? Join me, Thane Stenner, founder of Stenner Wealth Partners at CG Wealth Management and host of the Smart Wealth Podcast. Download today at iHeartRadio or your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe now.
We're back, everybody, with Lorne MacLean of MacLean Law. Let's get started. So, in the last 5 to 10 years, just again, for the viewer's sake, what would you say are some of the ideal or best practice scenarios for people that are going through a divorce or a separation? Like just some of the things you've observed to say, okay, that went smoothly, that didn't, kind of what went off the rails, communication styles, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so let's talk about, for example, ultra high net worth cases. Let's call it $30 million of assets and over $1 million a year of annual income. For those people, they're often involved in business ventures. They have partners. They have developments they're working on. What you don't want to happen if you're the business owner is for things to get out of control early on, where your partners or the business ventures that you're involved in sort of go under a cloud, and banks are a little bit nervous of lending to you. Your partners are wondering if this project is going to go ahead. So discretion for an ultra high net worth divorce lawyer is critical. Trying to keep it out of court is laudable, but depending on the circumstances, that might not be possible. So for example, if you're the wife that doesn't have the high net income and doesn't know about the business, and you have some doubts about what's happening with the money, staying out of court and being discreet might not work, because one of the first things we want to do is make sure that income and assets don't go missing while we are trying to sort out the valuation, identification, and the division of these assets. And so we may have to fire off to court right off the bat and get an injunction to allow the business owner to continue his business in the ordinary course. We don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, but making sure perhaps that money isn't drawn out of the company and diverted and hidden somewhere. So quite often there will be a restraining order put in place that makes sure that assets don't go missing. For example, we might freeze someone's $10 million stock account to the extent of them not being able to withdraw from it. But what you don't want to do in a market, and you know this is your business, the market's going up or down, you don't want to restrain the person from buying and selling stocks within the account and continuing to make money. And so, you have to have finesse. You want the business to continue to operate. You want it to keep making money. You want stocks to continue to operate. You want to make sure that the house mortgage is paid and repairs are done on the homes and people can drive their cars and things of that nature. So discretion, putting protections in place, and then you really want to make sure you found all the assets. So you've got to discover them. You then got to sort them into the various categories. So across Canada, there are a number of different regimes, but most of them will now sort of start out with an exclusion for the starting value of assets that are brought into the relationship. So someone brings in $1 million house, and at the end of the relationship, it's worth $2 million. We don't divide 2 million in half. We only divide the gain in half, 1 million. Then if you have inheritances and gifts that were to one spouse alone, those are usually across Canada in another special category. Why do I say this? Well, why does that make sense? Well, the concept is if you're working together, and one can be the breadwinner, one can be the homeowner, both can be breadwinners, but one might make more. We don't just look at who earned the money. We look at the whole package. Someone might be home raising the children and not able to work. And in the old days, the husbands were walking away with more than half the assets because they would argue, well, I paid for everything. Well, we're far past that sort of primitive approach to things. And now it's basically 50-50, but there still are these exclusions. So the focus is on assets acquired by the joint efforts of the parties while they were together. And that means homemaking. That means looking after the children. That means working. So there you go.
Well said. So as far as things like, or processes like mediation versus court, like what's your thoughts there again for the viewers? How often do you find conclusions amicable in mediation versus needing to take it to the court level?
Here's the good news. Only 3% of family law cases, this is an average across Canada, will end up having a trial. Now, there might be an interim hearing, a much higher percentage of interim hearings where interim and spousal and child support is put in place, interim child parenting and guardianship is put in place, but only 3% of cases go to trial. So people can perhaps breathe a sigh of relief there. In the old days, lawyers would pick up the phone and settle that between themselves. And then somehow it got to the next stage where we'd have a four-way meeting where we take both the spouses and both the lawyers would go and we have a chat around a table. We get a ton of them settled that way. Along then came mediation. So now there was less phone calls of the lawyers and less four-way meetings because, well, now everyone thought, oh, we just have to use a mediator. You don't even have to get to the mediation stage, but people are now used to that. So we mediate all the time. The mediators are experienced family law lawyers, usually, that give you sort of their straight goods. And then, there's a bit of arm twisting in both rooms. And there's a risk assessment done. One of the things that helps cases get settled is no one can be really sure exactly what the outcome is going to be. And so this is why the government has been coming up with these formulaic approaches, the spousal support advisory guidelines, to help people know what the range is a bit better. But even then within that range, people can argue. So, but uncertainty is the friend of settlement because no one can be certain that they're going to be a winner. And so usually at a mediation, we have a phrase, it's not a fair settlement unless both sides aren't a little bit upset when they leave the room. And that's just the reality of family law life.
Yeah, or the definition of fair, right? A lot of times it's basically where both sides aren't perfectly happy, right?
Yeah, it's like buying a house. Some thinks I paid too much, and the seller might say, I wish I could have got more. But it's a business transaction.
Gotcha. So tell us about the one case. I think you literally set the high water mark in Canada for, you referenced it earlier, was roughly $100,000 a month in spousal support. So
right.
I presume some of that is public. It probably got some pretty good press, if I had to guess.
Yeah, that one made the front page of the Vancouver Sun and was ended up in the South China News and in China and in Singapore because the husband lived in Singapore, was a neurologist there, and the wife lived in West Vancouver. Some of the, it probably, unfortunately for me, sits at number 3 in the top 3 Canadian history of the highest awards. The highest is McCain. So, the French fries, 1 in every 3 French fries sold in the world is McCain's. That was $175,000 to the wife, but Mr. McCain's income was far higher than Dr. Devatheson's. Then there was Herjavec, the Dancing with the Stars and the Dragon's Den gentleman. That was $125,000, but since he lived in the United States and could not deduct it like he could if he was in Canada, that award was reduced to $60,000. And I guess I come in at second then because of that correction. So second and sort of by far the highest, most recent one, the McCain one, was 2012. So it got a lot of attention. There was one child, she got $21,000 a month and was living in a $3 million condominium.
Yes.
So they did well.
Yeah. So this week we had a federal budget, right? Came out with some certain things. So I'm sure that you are incorporating some of those changes already into your strategy and planning, right? Capital gains taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So
right.
And maybe just a blush on that. I know you're not an accountant, but you do valuation work, or opinions on it, right? In cases. So
well, this is massively important. And I would say probably one of the top 3 mistakes made by people is failing to take into account the different valuations of different classes of assets. So $1 million business is not equal to $1 million primary residence family home. Why do I say that? Well, as you know, even though the new budget came in and jacked up the capital gains rates on people, everybody basically, but they like to say it's only for people that are earning over 1.4 million, which is our low end client base. They didn't jack up or didn't take away the primary residence. So your family home is the best asset to get from a tax perspective. You take that one all day long. Your next best would be your stocks, your family vacation home, which until I think it's June 24th when this kicks in or whatever, you only had to pay a 50% tax on the gain, which works out to an effective rate of 25% versus 50 to 54. Still decent. Your worst asset, none of them are bad, but your worst asset from a tax perspective is your family business, because your family business might be worth $5 million. But to get that money out of the business and be able to use it to buy a house after separation to replace the house perhaps your spouse got, you're going to pay 54% tax or close to 40% on dividends. So when we are dividing assets, we want to make sure we're dealing with apples to apples and not apples and lemons. So a house worth $1 million might be, you know, the person with the business might get the first 2 million, for example. Other ways of dealing with business transactions and using tax as your friend is corporate reorganizations, where the spouse that wants to get a share of the assets in a company will set up a new corporation. We call it a butterfly. And so what can happen then is you can transfer money tax-free from company A to newly created company B, and then each person can draw the money out at their own pace and each pay their fair share of the tax. So
over time versus
over time.
Right, yeah.
Right. You don't want to draw it out. So, for example, if we had to give a compensation payment to the lower income spouse, let's say it's the husband in this case, to pull that out and give him that money, we'd lose 54% of it. Alternatively, he creates a new company, we transfer that same amount of money to him tax-free, and then he can draw $100,000 out a year to live on, sort of thing, and not take a big whack. So we're able to use the tax man as our friend in certain circumstances, even despite the aggressive tax regime of this liberal government.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, in your bio and from what I've observed you in action on, you know, complexity is kind of the norm when it comes to wealthier, you know, families in this type of scenario, right?
Well, you have assets around the world, and so you've got different tax regimes. We'll get into this whole concept of the discretionary trust, because most of our high net worth clients will have a family trust or perhaps be a beneficiary of an older generation that set one up for them. And there's different rules that apply to those. But that is a huge new area of law that's developing rapidly in Canada right now, is how do you deal with these discretionary trusts?
Agreed. So you know, as far as, did you ever think, you know, as a lawyer, you'd be having to learn so much around tax, valuations and whatnot? Like when you first started out, you probably were thinking, you know, you focus on the law and kind of what the guidelines are at the time. It's almost like you've become a forced expert on valuations. Would that be fair?
Like I said, we have to know corporate law. We have to know tax law. We have to know trust law. So we are like a Swiss Army knife, but we got to be good at all of them, because you can't make a mistake in any one of those categories, or you know, there's potential harm to your client. So you've always got to be thinking. And of course, in the law game, one of the things that makes it so stressful is your opponent is always thinking, everybody's thinking how they can get the best for their client. Nobody trusts the other person until you get that final deal done. So you just got to be very careful, but it's totally fascinating. For those people that say family law is the easiest area of law, they haven't practiced high net worth family law at all.
No, exactly. So you just touched upon a word there, which I'll kind of come back to, trust. So, you know, given the fact that most cases eventually get mediated, what have you seen as ways of building trust between parties? Although they're splitting up, what have you actually seen them do to try to accelerate the process or make it less painful of a process to go through?
All right. So you really want to make full disclosure from the start, because and it often happens, someone will forget something. It's not that they did it deliberately, but the other side will tend to portray that must have been a deliberate omission. And then how much else have they omitted? And so it becomes a problem. I tell my clients, one mistake is too many, one lie is too many, because even if you're telling the truth and all the other stuff, now you may not be believed. And so making full disclosure, not making it personal. You want an aggressive lawyer, but you need a lawyer that has finesse. So it's not just writing a bunch of rude accusatory letters, because that's not going to help you get a settlement if all you're doing is attacking the other side. So and we have a no-fault regime now. So people need to know that if someone's had an affair, that doesn't mean you pay more or you get less, or the spousal support goes up, or you don't get spousal support at all, or you get less than half or more than half the assets. It's irrelevant. And what we're trying to do is get people away from that emotional side of it, the blame game, because that really runs up a big bill.
Yep.
And so when people don't trust the other side, at the beginning, I tell them, we need to be reasonably certain we're correct in believing there's missing assets, because we can spend a lot of money chasing them. And if we find out that nothing, in fact, was missing, you'll have spent a significant amount of money. On the other side of it, we can't simply ignore that there might be missing assets, because then we could be leaving millions on the table. So it's difficult.
Balancing act. Yeah.
So the more people are transparent, the cheaper they are. Like there's the most expensive divorces will occur where you have two highly conflictual people. Some psychologists say, the percentage of borderline personality disorder is 4%. The amount of cases that go to court is 4%. Do the math.
Yeah.
So, but it only takes one person to be a little off kilter psychologically for a case to get derailed. So your simplest cases are two people that want to be fair. An expensive one can be a person wants to be a doormat and the other person's out for blood. And the most expensive is both people are out for blood. And those, and then at the end of the day, they may say, oh man, I wish I'd taken a different approach. So we're trying to manage expectations, but at the same time, we want to maximize the result for our clients.
Yeah.
And their children, of course.
Listen, everybody, we're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us.
Want to know how Canada's top entrepreneurs think about creating significant wealth? Join me, Thane Stenner, founder of Stenner Wealth Partners at CG Wealth Management and host of the Smart Wealth podcast. Download today at iHeartRadio or your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe now.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm with my guest, Lorne MacLean of MacLean Law. Let's get started again. There is subtlety and nuances and finesse, as you mentioned earlier, in your role, no doubt. And again, there's just like anything, there's average doctors, there's good doctors, and there's great doctors. Same thing in the legal profession. So how would you say you've learned to finesse certain things? Like, is it right up front you try to establish kind of guidelines or ground rules, or is it the types of questions that you ask? How is it that kind of differentiate yourself?
I mean, I think I'm a reasonable guy, but most lawyers that I'm against would say that I'm probably the most aggressive. I just think I'm determined and I'm firm. And some lawyers would say I would never ask for $100,000 of spousal support. And I have no problem asking for $100,000 of spousal support, and I got it.
Yep.
And that was after the lady also got $25 million of property. And the husband was dishonest in the proceedings. He had forged documents. He had altered medical records.
Wow.
And we got a $1.5 million special cost award. So it's extremely rare for the court to award full indemnity for what was paid by her to me. And in this case, it was $1.5 million because we had to battle this gentleman for months, and the trial was 30 days long. So he had to pay 100% of her legal fees. He said he would never pay spousal support. So the judge said, MacLean says it'll have to be a lump sum. So instead of the $100,000 a month, he said for the next 5.5 years, you'll pay that up front. That's $5 million. It made it worse for him by saying he wouldn't pay monthly. And then he had to pay it up front, no tax deduction. So being a jerk in divorce, bad strategy. Trying to say you're fair, but still being aggressive, it's basically salesmanship. You are a salesman. You're just a highly skilled salesman that's selling your version of the solution to the judges being the fair solution.
Gotcha. Well said. Very well said. So maybe just share with us a couple cases, maybe some stories a little bit more that kind of may be relatable in today's type of market place.
Yeah, I mean, some of the wildest ones, of course, this $100,000 a month and $21,000 for the daughter, $25 million. That one, played out in the media for long periods of time. Another interesting case where a wealthy businessman from China married my client in Las Vegas, but it turned out that in fact he was already married, and she was asking him to produce the divorce certificate from his first wife, which he never did. Well, it turned out he was already married, and so he said, well, I can't be married a second time then, so that means I don't owe any money to my second wife. BC Court of Appeal disagreed. He had invested about $20 million in property here in British Columbia, and even though second marriage is not legal in British Columbia, the same marriage rules apply as if you were married, even though it was a void marriage. And so that one made its way around the world. My son Fraser just did one with a gentleman from China, assets 70 to 90 million, said he made 150,000. Fraser persuaded the judge that it was closer to $1 million, and that was even on the low side. And as a result, got $32,000 a month, which would be a top 5 in British Columbia right now. That's not bad for a 5-year call. Chip off the old block. You'll probably be better than me in another few years. So, we have, arguments over pets. In British Columbia, we now have new pet legislation. And I think the other day a judge made an order for shared, we don't really call it custody, but shared parenting of a pet. And, we had a case worth hundreds of millions of dollars where it really came down to fighting over who would get the dogs. And the dogs were 10 and 8. And at the end of the day, you got settled by them each having one, which meant the dogs were separated from each other. I'm not sure how they felt, but these are the interesting things. I've had other cases that we couldn't get settled until 2 a.m. at a mediation, fighting over an old couch. I'm like, it's an old couch. I'll buy you a couch myself. I need that couch. And so we got it. But, taxes,
it sounds like to me the emotions are kind of the big wild card in your profession.
Right. And people think, well, do you have to know about criminal law as a family lawyer? I've jailed a man for 6 months for lying and hiding. And so we had a gentleman that had a Asian wholesale meat company, and a lot of the sales were in cash, whereby it wasn't obviously on the books, and he had so much cash that he had 3 cash counters at home. He had a picture of his baby on the bed it was covered in $100 bills because that was supposed to be very lucky. We raided his office in Richmond. It's called an Anton Pillar raid, where we went with a team of 20 people, went through the door and went through his garbage cans and found his second group of invoices. So he had one group of invoices with 5 digits and his company name on them. He had the second cash invoices, 4 digits, no identification on them, and a laptop that had the secret cash details on it. When we proved that to the judge, he was sent away for up to 6 months. He got out for time served at good behavior after a month, but has since left the country now. So that might have been the wildest one, where we actually jailed someone and raided his premises.
So Lorne, I got to ask you this question then, based upon some of those stories. So what inside you as a professional, as a person, kind of innately has that drive to try to go to that distance for your client?
Well, to me, it feels like a detective story or a James Bond movie where we are on the hunt and we are going to ferret out, this missing information. We are going to make sure that the truth is told to the court. So I find those ones the most fascinating, when there's some misconduct by the other side, and we are really on the side of justice.
Well said.
But other times it's, here's the real goal. Here's what you really want in your divorce lawyer. You want a person that can get you through the system and out the other side as cheaply and quickly as possible. The goal is to make both parents winners after divorce, so they're not filled with bitterness or recrimination. And that means your kids are going to do so much better as well. Like, you may not have been good spouses, but you're always going to be parents of your children. And so the other focus is trying to reduce the conflict so the children aren't scarred for the rest of their lives. So they grow up to be healthy and productive individuals. So on the custody side, it's really, that's where the big change has come. We don't call it custody anymore. We call it parenting time. When I first started back in the 1980s, moms were the primary caregivers. We didn't have joint custody. And so, in the late 80s, you could start to get joint custody if you could show that you could cooperate. Well, when the husbands first started going to court, the judge said the very fact you're in court means you can't cooperate. So the wives would just say, we can't cooperate, knowing they could block it. And the judges went, just a minute, this is not working. Like, why are we 50-50 on property division? Why are we 50-50 on spousal support? But God forbid we should have shared parenting. So I started developing this. I said, come on, judge. And they said, okay, you're right. I think we've got to put something in place where the fathers get more time. And even if there's going to be conflict, we're going to have some counseling for them, and they're going to have to work through that conflict. But we can't just have people walking in saying, we can't agree, thinking that will give them the hammer. And so now this is probably the biggest, and I think probably one of the most productive things in the development of the Canadian family law system is we're really moving to, can't say it's a default position of shared 50-50, but it's darn close to it. And it's getting closer to a presumption every year. And I think that's better for the kids. In most cases, there are going to be some where one of those parents has real parenting capacity issues, and they may need supervision, random drug and alcohol testing. I'm not talking about shared under those circumstances.
Yes.
But just because the wife was the primary caregiver, because the husband was the breadwinner, is no longer a reason to not have shared 50-50. Things change. The marriage ended. Things are now different. Both people need to start working on self-sufficiency. And by doing shared custody, you're actually helping the lower income spouse get back into the career force. And so everybody's a winner. So I really think that's, Canadian government legislation and the judges have done an excellent job in that regard.
Given your history and your background and expertise, what would you say are your observations of divorces or separations or whatnot through the economic cycle? Do you see, is it pretty consistent,
Well,
or does it seem to get more prominent during a downturn when there's more pressure in the relationship?
I think one of the aspects of being a family lawyer is that the business is steady, regardless of whether the economy is booming, because in those cases, often there's more to fight over, or if the economy is down, which means there's more fighting between the spouses. So, what's interesting, is, is really the growth in the gray divorce area. So people that were older weren't divorcing. That's doubled since the 1990s. Twice as many people divorcing over age 50 as in the 1990s. And I don't know if it's the social media or, the Kardashians and all, or the Rupert Murdochs, all these people saying all these guys have multiple partners, whether that's had an impact or whether people just have a shorter attention span or just not willing to, tough it out or put the energy into the relationship. But, sometimes at the end of a relationship in a high net worth, and this is an important concept I want to share with your viewers. So in a long-term relationship where multi-million dollars of assets have been built up and children have been born, so the person that kept their career, say you have a homemaker and a breadwinner, the breadwinner really receives three benefits of that long marriage. One, they grow their career. Two, they get half of the multi-million dollars of assets that they developed with their spouse. And three, they have the benefit of children. But the homemaker only gets 2 out of 3. So they only get half of the appreciation in the assets, and they get the benefit of the children. But the one thing they don't have is a career. And so that's why now, even in these multi-million-dollar property division cases, significant spousal support is still paid. Back in the 2000s, if you got a $4 million settlement, you got zero spousal support. Fast forward to DeVathison, she got $25 million. She got $100,000 a month support upfront until age 75, with liberty to go back for more support after 75. So if you're a high income earner, there's no set cutoff date, which for the high income earners is highly annoying, I can tell you. So that's why you want to encourage both spouses to have careers. You're in no danger if you can both be earning the same. You can walk away, no problem. But there's a large disparity you're going to have to pay in Canada. Like I said, we're one of the most generous countries for both child support and spousal support.
I mentioned it earlier at the beginning, King's Counsel versus Queen's Counsel. Can you just, for those that aren't familiar with that phraseology and designation, what is that, Lorne?
Right. Well, they're equivalent, but what happened was, Queen Elizabeth was queen for so long that that's the only phrase people really know. But when she died and King Charles became the king, we automatically transitioned from being a Queen's Counsel to a King's Counsel. So they're equivalent. It's the King's Counsel. It's not a higher designation. It's just who's on the throne in England that determines whether it's a QC or a KC.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. So to wrap us up here, this has been an excellent interview, Lawrence, and thanks again for taking the time. Just maybe to wrap up or summarize kind of the top 2 or 3 things that you would suggest or just give to our audience from point of view of things that you've learned or that you would generally advise people if they're considering that important step. What would the top 2 or 3 things be?
So number one, given how generous the Canadian spousal and child support is, I think the first thing, if you're considering a new relationship, is to have a prenup. So if you think you're going to be a successful person, you're the person that really needs a prenup. And you need to negotiate that well in advance of the start of the relationship, well in advance of the marriage date. You need to make full disclosure. You need to make sure that the other spouse has proper independent legal advice. Number 2, during the marriage and before the divorce or separation, you want to have as much knowledge of the family finances as possible. Knowledge is power. So it's really important, if you're the non-business owning spouse, that you ask for updates or you be involved and you have try to have a general understanding of how the business works, because nothing's worse than being in the dark and being uncertain and then having all these doubts. Number 3, you want to encourage both spouses to have a career during the relationship if it's at all possible. And if that isn't possible, you need to understand what the ramifications are. So you need to have that talk at the beginning. And then number 4, you want to make full disclosure. You don't want to approach your divorce with bitterness. You want to get professional help. So assassins is probably too strong a word, but your family lawyer is not the most touchy-feely person to help you with the stresses of the divorce. We'll minimize the stress of the litigation as much as we can. But I do recommend that people have a therapist or a counselor, at least in the initial stages of the separation. And then it's really important that people look in the mirror and try to have some insight into what their role was instead of always trying to blame the other side, because judges look at that when they're listening to a person on the stand. If they see a person that can see no good in their spouse, the judge is like, either you're not being honest or you're just a really bad pick of a spouse, because that's the person that you selected. And one of the things I also ask people at the beginning of a relationship is to pick wisely. So one of the tests that I thought was pretty cool from listening to counselors and marriage therapists was, would you trust your spouse to look after your children if you died and do a good job of it? And if so, that that's a person that's a winner that should be with you. But if you don't have that confidence, then you probably should pick a different person.
And on those wise notes, I think we'll wrap there, Lorne. Want to really thank you once again for your time. I know it was at least a billable hour, so I know how valuable that is. And we'll make sure that people know where your website is and whatnot for your firm. So thank you once again. Enjoy your day, and thanks for your insights that you brought today.
Pleasure chatting with you. Good to see you again. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Thanks, Bye. Lorne. Bye-bye for now. Thanks, everybody, for listening with my special guest, Lorne MacLean of MacLean Law, King's Counsel on family law legal matters. It's a great session. Hope you really enjoy. I also want to thank the BNN Bloomberg brand studio team for the production of this podcast. They do a great job, and super happy to have them kind of produce these each month. And lastly, my name is Thane Stenner of CG Wealth Management and Stenner Wealth Partners, and look forward to having you attend next month's podcast. Thank you. See you soon.
The comments and opinions expressed in this podcast are the results of work done by Stenner Wealth Partners. They may differ from the opinion of Canaccord Genuity Corp. and should not be considered as representative of Canaccord's beliefs, opinions, or recommendations. All views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. The statements expressed herein are not intended to provide tax, legal, or financial advice, and under no circumstances should be construed as a solicitation to act as a securities broker or dealer in any jurisdiction. All views are intended for general circulation only and do not have any regard to the specific investment objectives, financial situation, or general needs of any particular person, organization, or institution. Canaccord is a member of the CIPF. The comments expressed in this podcast are the results of work done by Stenner Wealth Partners. They may differ from the opinion of Canaccord Genuity Corp. and should not be considered as representative of Canaccord's beliefs, opinions, or recommendations. All views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. The statements expressed herein are not intended to provide tax, legal, or financial advice, and under no circumstances should be construed as a solicitation to act as a securities broker or dealer in any jurisdiction. All views are intended for general circulation only and do not have any regard to the specific investment objectives, financial situation, or general needs of any particular person, organization, or institution. Canaccord is a member of the CIPF.